Can everyone hear me? So, last year I was working on grandmothers in science fiction and novels, and I talked here at Estcon about that. And then at the end of the year, I was invited to talk about Star Trek and look at representation of age and aging in Star Trek and old people in Star Trek. And I knew that I was going to have to watch a lot of Star Trek in order to do this, and not just things I hadn't seen, but things I'd seen before. Because one thing I learned from my grandmothers in space is that I couldn't trust my own memory. What I thought I'd seen, I remembered old people, I didn't remember old people. And so I needed to rewatch it. So I took a look, and to watch every piece of Star Trek out there, I worked it out to be 25 days of non-stop watching, which didn't really seem like it was going to happen. So over a 2-month period, I watched 193 episodes of Star Trek and 7 movies, and I wrote detailed analyses of 50 different episodes, which were looking at those episodes where old people existed, where aging existed, and how did the franchise, starting with the original Star Trek, treat the process of getting older. And Cliff's not here today, but he watched every single one with me, which is why he's forgiven for not being here today. So I found my very first representation of old age on the first day. The Cage was the original pilot that was filmed for Star Trek. It was rejected for being too cerebral. It was not that cerebral. But in the episode, Captain Pike and the away team discover the survivors of the SS Columbia. And those survivors are all men in their 80s. And they had crashed 18 years before, which means that the crew were all in their 60s when they crashed, which has never ever happened in Star Trek. There's never been a crew, even with an average age of anything over 40, really. So, and then there's one young woman, Vina, 18, beautiful blonde, and she was said to have been born just before the crash. And it all turns out to be an illusion meant to tempt Captain Pike to stay on the planet and breed with their only female human, their only female specimen. Now there's a lot of argument as to how old was she really. But the script, and here it is in Estonian, makes it very clear. When the illusion was dropped, Vina rapidly grew older, and at the end, she was Vina, old, shockingly twisted, and ugly. And everybody happily agrees that, oh, she can't possibly live like that. She's much better off alone and lonely here on this planet as a zoo specimen than to be old and disfigured. Now this pilot episode was later edited into the Menagerie, which was later in the first series, and Spock, who was the only character who was both in this pilot and in the later crew, risked his career to take the disabled Captain Pike to Talos 4. Now Pike is reunited. We're not sure how old Pike is here, but he's reunited with 18-year-old Vina, and they run off to breed. And everyone is happy. And the moral of the story seems to be that living a virtual life in exile has got to be better than living in a wheelchair in Starfleet, where apparently no one knows Morse code, because Pike can only answer yes or no questions. He can't actually interact. And so this isn't a great message, that life is not worth living when you're old or infirm or losing mobility. Meanwhile, the Star Trek crew had a big turnaround. Spock replaced number 1 as the first officer. The experienced Captain Pike is traded for James T. Kirk, the youngest captain in Starfleet. Dr. Boyce loses 20 years to become 39-year-old Dr. McCoy. And there's a clear aging down to be seen among the crew. But there's also a major stylistic change, which is that the female crew all get miniskirts. Now, I can argue that miniskirts are sexist and objectifying, or I can argue that they are a sign of liberation and women capturing their own sexuality. But either way, there's one key thing about miniskirts. Our grandmothers don't wear them. So having a regulation uniform where you must wear a miniskirt effectively is a promise that Starfleet crew will never include old women. The uniforms were based on airline stewardesses at the time. And airlines promoted their cabin crew as glamorous and single and, most importantly, young. And they achieved this by only hiring women between 20 and 26. And the airlines presumed that once they got married or got old, they would leave, and it would be fine. But then the women didn't go. They continued to want to do their job. So the airlines, many airlines, amended their contracts to include a forced retirement at 32. 32 is too old to be a stewardess. So whether you think about Star Trek miniskirts as exploitation or as sexual liberation, making that the regulation that Starfleet women had to wear was clearly ageist. And this was at exactly the time that the US airlines were being sued for discrimination for their retirement age of 32 only for women. Now, the original series doubles down on this view of women being prized as young, because they repeatedly use old age as a threat against women. And these women react with terror at a view of themselves with wrinkle and white hair. And in Charlie X, this rage-filled adolescent with superpowers who is angry infects this woman with old age, and she crumples to the ground, screaming. And in The Children Shall Lead, Uhura cries out in horror when a vision shows what she will look like when she's old, with wrinkled skin and bushy eyebrows. And she describes this as seeing her own death. And even later, in Deep Space Nine, the ageless Q punishes Vash for dumping him by infecting her with boils and then afflicting her with old age, gray hair, wizened hand, and she is unable to stand up. And although sudden or rapid aging appears in 16 episodes, it's only ever used in anger against women until Voyager, when Harry Kim is turned into an old man by the clown for even thinking about escaping. So this is very, very targeted at women. But the old men or the men of Star Trek also fear old age. And it's not used as a threat against them, but there is repeatedly the sudden appearance of white hair, wrinkles, and incompetence. The Deadly Years. The crew meet Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, who are played by actors in their 80s, but say that they are 29 and 27. And the crew all start aging, and they give us the numbers. They are aging at a rate of 30 years per day. And they're mostly in their 20s and 30s. But within the hour, they lose their hearing, they start suffering from dementia, and advanced arthritis, their joints. And Spock warns that within a few days, they will all be mental vegetables. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Roberts die almost immediately with a cause of old age. And Lieutenant Arlene Galloway, who is the youngest crew member, also dies of old age in Kirk's arms. And this is part of a recurring trope in Star Trek, which is old people die. Now, it sounds silly, because of course old people die, but if you are an old person on Star Trek and you aren't in the main crew, you are less likely to survive than a red shirt, because generally by the end of the episode, or regularly by the end of the episode, you are dead. Now, meanwhile, in here, Kirk is described as in his 60s. He's under 71. And He's unable to stay awake, he's unable to hear what people say, he can't remember things he was just told, and finally, he is told that he is unfit to lead. And all of this is explained by the fact that, well, he's old. And that's what happens in your 60s. And this is just such an awful thing that I went ahead and I made a collection of Estonians who are over 60 and they seem to be completely competent. They aren't falling asleep mid-sentence. They aren't unable or unfit to do their jobs. So this is where we see what was almost certainly Roddenberry with a view of after 60, you're past it. And I've been told, well, that's just what Hollywood was like at the time, or that was just a sign of the times. But that's not true. It's not as simple as that. Because if we look at popular American series that were on at the same time, in the top 10, we have Granny and the Beverly Hillbillies, Endora in Bewitched, Doc in Gunsmoke. And Ed Sullivan was 65, and no one thought he was too old to have his own show. Besides, Roddenberry pitched Star Trek as Wagon Train to the Stars. And Wagon Train was a popular Western television show in the late 50s and early 60s with a star who was in his mid-50s. And they had the same system. It was an ensemble cast of characters traveling across the US, and every week was a standalone story of a problem with guest stars coming in and being there for the one episode. And they had a lot of famous guest stars, including Joan Crawford, Lou Costello, Bette Davis, Ronald Reagan, Shelley Winters, Charles Bronson, and even, though he was not so famous at the time, Leonard Nimoy. But the Trail Master is nothing like young Captain Kirk. He's much more like Captain Pike. He's an authority figure. He's presented as supporting the travelers through his wealth of experience. His scout is 34, his cook is 54. He is not surrounded by 20-something people who are there to make up for his age. But Star Trek continues to have this fear of getting old. So it becomes central to the first Star Trek film, the motion picture, which was released in 1979. And it's the first time that the franchise had to deal with the fact that these actors are getting older when they don't want the story to get older. So Shatner had just turned 48, but they decided that within the Star Trek universe, only a few years had passed. And Kirk was not yet 40, because 40... So fandom gossip says that Shatner went on a near-starvation diet and that he wore a corset underneath his one-piece uniform. Special lighting and camera tricks, lots of soft focus were used to disguise the lines appearing on the faces of the middle-aged actors trying to play younger crew. And it didn't work. The reviews were scathing. I don't know if you can read that, but they described the crew as old men in V-necks, and an odd assortment of grumpy middle-aged men bickering about office politics. And Kirk specifically was described as a supercilious old twit. And I think, personally, these reviews are more about the age gap between the actors and the roles they were supposed to be playing, as opposed to the fact that people refused to accept a crew over 35. And it wasn't a great film anyway, but Star Trek the Motion Picture served one really important purpose. It proved how hungry the audience were to have more Star Trek, to get more Star Trek. And never again were aging actors asked to portray a younger crew within the Star Trek universe. Now, Shatner had turned 51 by the time the Wrath of Khan came out. And that was released in 1982, and it begins with Kirk celebrating his birthday, but we're never told which one. 58-year-old McCoy gives him spectacles, ancient, antique spectacles to help his aging eyes. And retirement age in Starfleet is 75. So why everybody in their 50s is like, well, you're almost past it, sorry mate, makes no sense within this universe. So it certainly doesn't seem like any of the original crew are going to make it to 75, let alone keep working. And then we have Con Noonien Singh, played by Ricardo Montalban, and he's excellent. Con is hundreds of years old because he was put into suspended animation when he was in his mid-30s. Now when Ricardo Montalban played that role in Space Seed, he was 47. So he was already much older than his character. When Wrath of Khan came out, he was 62. And so you have this all-star cast of Star Trek actors, all or mostly over 50. And Wrath of Khan is a much, much better attempt to deal with aging. And in fact, McCoy and Kirk, as opposed to talking about how they've lost it, McCoy warns Kirk to get his command back before he gets old. So we've suddenly turned the narrative into something else. And the film was notable for being an action film and a sci-fi film starring men who are 50 and over. And in a promotional clip, an interviewer raves about the movie, saying, Star Trek II makes it respectable to be over 35. And Shatner responds with, but not much over, and not very respectable. Still, it was daring to do this when that same year the oldest lead character in a sci-fi film was Harrison Ford, who had just turned 40. And Star Trek went all the way with a plot that led to 62-year-old Ricardo Montalban baring his chest and seizing control of the Reliant. He is fully powerful. And so, to my mind, Wrath of Khan marks the real beginning of a coming-of-age sequence in which the crew and Hollywood are forced to accept that not only is it respectable to be over 35, but there's still action after 50. And by the time we get to the undiscovered country, Kirk stops complaining about being bored and stops going on about his glory days, and in fact complains when he is asked to step up again and says, but we've done our bit for king and country. He wants to be left in peace. Now, in the final frontier, we also get to see how wrong Uhura's vision was of what she was going to look like when she got old. Her hair is gray, but her manners confident and sexy. Her uniform goes between trousers and a relatively short skirt, but nothing skin tight, nothing is too provocative in her new outfit. But she's still willing to show off her body for an erotic dance. Okay, lots of lighting effects, lots of silhouettes, but still, the 57-year-old Nichelle Nichols absolutely nails this scene. Now, it's during the release of these films that The Next Generation came out. The pilot episode, Encounter at Farpoint, again deals with aging, in that it shows Dr. McCoy as an aging admiral brought on board to inspect the medical facilities of the Enterprise. He's 137 years old, and he looks not a day younger than when he was 70, not a day older, I'm sorry, than when he was 70 in the Deadly Years. At the heart of The Next Generation is Jean-Luc Picard, who is described as, oh, we finally have an older captain, but he was an even more experienced starship captain than we have ever seen in the past, is his description for the call list. He's scripted as 59, but actually Patrick Stewart was only 46. We also meet a young character, 15-year-old Wesley Crusher, as played by Will Wheaton, representing the fact that the crew can now bring their families on board. And the Writer's Director's Guide in 1987 says that the starship has over 1,000 residents, and specifically, quote, Starfleet has begun encouraging crew persons to share the space exploration adventure with their families because people need people for mental and physical health. But this appears to only apply to children. The Enterprise's daycare unit is stable enough that they take on Worf's 2-year-old with no notice, but there's no equivalent elder care. Worf's father is clearly old, but then again he's dead before the episode is over. And you would think that with a retirement age of 75 and an admiral who's 137, it might just be possible that someone on the Enterprise could be over 60. But they're not in evidence at any time. This becomes even more noticeable in Deep Space Nine, because it's set on a space station rather than a starship. And Deep Space Nine accommodates 7,000 people. They offer shopping, leisure centers, a casino. The Bajorans have similar lifespans to humans and share the same aging characteristics. And still, it's rare to see a wrinkled face or even a flash of gray among the inhabitants of the space station. And it's not a question of protocol, because Sisko, as commander of the station, repeatedly asks his aging father to join him on the station, and the father refuses. Sisko, by the way, is 37, so almost as young as Kirk. I've completely lost my place. There we go. And superficially, the core cast show a much greater age range, with Jake Sisko at 14, and Dax is over 300 years old, but Dax is in the 28-year-old body of Jadzia, so our old character is represented by a young and beautiful woman. The oldest cast member is Rene Auberjonois. I don't know how to say his name. Odo! But the changeling is meant to be young, is described as young, and his facial features have been wiped away to reflect his inability to present himself as human, giving him a face that's as smooth as a baby's. If you average together the core cast, you get an average age of 36. Now, to its credit, Deep Space Nine has a number of recurring characters who are visibly older, and they don't simply appear just to die. Sisko's father, of course, but also Cardassian Ennebrand Tain, the Klingons Kang, Kor, and Koloth, the Ferengi Grand Nagus Zek, Ishka, and the occasional visiting Bajoran. And Dr. Julian Bashir turns 30 at the start of the series. We get to see another rapid aging where Cardassian Ellen Garrick is perplexed at his response to his birthday. I wasn't aware that humans saw growing old as a negative experience. On Cardassia, advanced age is seen as a sign of power and dignity. And Dr. Bashir is given his comeuppance, rapidly aging to 100 before being returned to his natural age. So we are definitely seeing an attitude of wanting to undo ageism by the time we get to DS9. Just as long as we don't have to live with them. The fourth Star Trek series, Voyager, has a more mature crew, with Captain Catherine Janeway and Chakotay are both in their 40s. Tuvok is 107, but that's fairly middle-aged for a Vulcan, and he's played by a 39-year-old actor. The Doctor is a hologram, but he is represented by an older face, played by 42-year-old Robert Picardo. And the older crew work well with the 20-something crew members, B'Elanna Torres, Tom Paris, Harry Kim, and later 7 of 9. And again, old age comes up in the pilot episode. This time by a member of an ancient race, the Nassine, which manifests as an old black American man who is played by 83-year-old Basil Langdon. Now this is interesting because generally ancient aliens manifesting as human show themselves as younger. So Balok appears as a child in the Corbinite maneuver. The Metron in the arena says that he's 15 Earth years old and is described as barely older than a boy. And the Salt Vampire in the Man Trap initially appears as a young woman to everyone but Kirk. And Mariana in Voyager is a young woman attractive to 22-year-old Harry Kim in Alter Ego. Q and Guinan in The Next Generation both appear as young adults, even though they've lived through centuries. And in Innocence, a 96-year-old woman
9.6
appears as a small child as she approaches death. In Star Trek Insurrection, the young woman Anij is revealed to be over 300 years old. In fact, the oldest manifestation of an alien race appears to be the child Trelane in the Square of Gothos, who appears to be almost middle-aged. Now that's in addition to the caretaker in Voyager's pilot episode, and in original Star Trek there was another caretaker who also manifested as an older man in Shore Leave. But they both die of old age after appearing in only one episode. So old people die. But at least these episodes showed old men. And in many instances, including Insurrection, they are entirely done away with. Because Paradise is populated by young people, preferably young people with blonde hair. We see this in the wild partying of the Naked Time, and then in the Naked Now, where the show deals nervously with the idea that Picard might be under the influence of the party drug. We see it in the attractive blonde-haired Edo in Justice, and in the ageless inhabitants of Gamma Trianguli 6 in The Apple. It applies to most of the population of Benea in ex post facto, with the notable exception, one man, one murdered man, showing once again that old people die. And then in Return of the Archons, there's festivals of debauchery which specifically is stated to exclude old men. And for reasons that they never explained, there are no old women at all. So to move on again on Star Trek, we have to go backwards. We have to go to the Enterprise, which takes place 100 years before Kirk and his crew will take command of the ship. Enterprise features another group of young actors forming the human crew and long-lived aliens standing in for the more experienced characters. And T'Pol is 63, young by Vulcan standards, and played by 26-year-old Jolene Blalock. Phlox is said to be 52, but then again, the Nebulans have long lifespans. And that actor is the oldest of the regular crew at 41. The over 50s are limited to outsiders again. Admiral Forrest, Soval, Eric Song. The Enterprise relies less on the Alien of the Week format, and so it manages to sidestep much of the colonialist attitudes from earlier Star Trek. But on the other hand, when they encounter a 116-year-old copy of their ship in E², it's noticeable that Lorien's Enterprise is 3 generations older and still crewed by 20-somethings. The human crew, the original human crew, are long dead because nobody lives to be 137 anymore. But T'Pol has survived. Now, Vulcan lifespan is known to be over 200 years. And to compare, Soval looks middle-aged, even though he's over 120. Sarek didn't begin to look old until he was over 200, and this was explained by his illness. He was suffering from Bendy disease. But at 180 years old, T'Pol is described in the script as wizened, white-haired, and with gnarled hands. Her face is covered with liver spots, although her liver is someplace completely different. And there's no explanation as to why she looks like an old crone, other than the idea that over time, women get old and ugly, men get distinguished. And there's never any reason given as to why no one from the second generation of the ship is in any position of power. They've all left it to the kids. And perhaps if the crew had sought out, the original Enterprise had sought out the older members of the generation ship, they might have gotten the 100 years worth of data that Lorien's Enterprise has been collecting, but no, they get no data, they get no information on the Expanse. And so, although over time Star Trek can be seen to be aging somewhat more gracefully, it still has its flaws. In Discovery, we get the seasoned and worldly wise Captain Philippa Georgiou, played by 55-year-old ancient Michelle Yeoh, as an experienced and competent captain, but more importantly, still in her prime. Unfortunately, she's the oldest member of the crew, and she dies in the first episode. Then Kelpian Saru is played by a 57-year-old actor, but he's young for a Kelpian. And it's hard to consider that to be a representation of old age under all that makeup and CGI. The next captain, Gabrielle Lorca, is also in his 50s, and overall, the series seems to have less of a focus on 20-somethings filling the screen. Paul Stamets, Hugh Culber, and Christopher Pike were all mid-40s for their first episodes on the show. Now, the flashbacks and forwards and mirror universe issues make it really tough to track character ages, although on the bright side, it does let us enjoy more of Georgiou. But more importantly, Discovery gives us real evidence that men and women in their 40s and 50s are not just unhappy, desk-bound, unsuited to space life, but they are a useful and important part of Starfleet. Discovery also manages to sidestep much of the ageism in the earlier series, and a lot of this is because it's serialized. There's one central storyline that takes us from episode to episode, rather than a new species and new planet and new problem every week. So by focusing on a single plot line, on a traveling starship, they never really have any reason to think about the elderly at all. It just doesn't come up. And then we saw the launch this year of the 7th Star Trek series. I was working on this project when it came out, and they said, we need to have what you've written the week before Picard starts. And I went, this is not possible. I cannot possibly talk about age and aging in Star Trek and not see Picard. So they gave me a 4-week extension. Now, Jean-Luc Picard is in his 90s in this show, and he's played by Patrick Stewart at 79. Picard also has a specific terminal neurological illness, giving him a real risk of mental decline, as opposed to just, you're old, so you're stupid. And there's no question that he must become a mental vegetable as a direct result of old age. He has a reason to fear this problem. And although old man is used as an insult in this series as well, when Admiral Clancy, who isn't very young either, accuses Picard of, quotes, harboring the pitiful delusions of a once great man desperate to matter. It's targeted. It's targeted at somebody who is trying to come back, and it feels more than just a general slur used against men of any age, but instead a targeted insult with a disturbing echo of truth. Now, obviously, I was thrilled with this turn of events and the amazing option of a science fiction film, an action film even, with a man of 79 in the lead role, playing a man of over 90, and he is at the start of something big rather than at the end. And I know a lot of it is because the Star Trek franchise has been going for 50 years now. But seeing the all-star cast with a dozen actors over 50 working with the younger crew, rather than being the ones left behind while the young people went and did things, it was really, really wonderful. I think this has got to be one of the most positive television portrayals of old age in science fiction. And it was only slightly let down by the end of season 1. Sorry, spoiler, put your hands on your ears if you have not seen it yet. Picard then dies. And is resurrected. Now, from a plot point of view...
He dies, but he gets better.
He gets better. And it is interesting that what he was fighting for is what he ends up becoming. But from an old people die point of view, it could have been better. So then, there's always this question of what does it matter, or why do I care? But they did an analysis of 2,000 screenplays of popular American movies, and they found the total words spoken by men over 65 was just 5% of the total of the dialogue. And that dropped to 3% for women over 65. And good representation is important because it's been shown to have a direct bearing on how we feel about old people and how we feel about growing old. There was a UK survey where they found that a quarter of the people they spoke to believed it was normal for old people to be depressed. It was normal for old people to be unhappy. And a third of them said, well, being lonely is just something that happens when you get old. And 40% believe that there was no escaping dementia as you got older. This is recent. This is not in the 1950s, that you must lose your mind as a direct result of getting older. And now the same study, when they spoke to the older people in the study, they found that those with a positive attitude towards old age ended up being less likely to suffer from depression, less likely to suffer from memory loss, and on average they lived 7 years longer. So a well-informed vision of growing old is not just to be fair to old people, but also to help us as we grow old. And to better understand the insidious representation that is in Hollywood, but was specifically in original Star Trek, compare Captain Kirk in The Deadly Years, absent-minded, lethargic, in his 60s, to William Shatner, who was born in 1931. He is still biking, he's still swimming, he's horse riding, he won a world competition in 2018, and he considers himself to be at his creative peak. Before the coronavirus outbreak, he was attending Star Trek events all around the world. And he was booked to speak at a German conference where I was going to speak about this issue and hope that he didn't come and hear me pointing it. This year, he's completed a blues album and he's launched a podcast to talk about cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology. So over the course of the last 50 years, it seems like Star Trek has come to an acceptance, both the cast and the writers, that growing old isn't all that bad, except for Picard. And I love that series, but just not the last episode. And that old message still came through, just slightly changed. Old people die, but androids live forever. Thank you.
Sylvia, what about Roxana Troy?
Yes, she's wonderful, and we have a problem with her because she's repeatedly referred to in scripts as middle-aged, and she gets pregnant. I have a hard time with, yes, here's a really good old woman who's also a new mother. So if you read it goes back and forth, but the implication is that she's in her equivalent of 40s and unhappy at being that old, that she's not actually older. I went back and forth on this one a lot. So there's different hints in the script. It's got to be different writers, right? But her age is up and down, and pregnant is a problem.
William Shatner should get to star in his own new series.
He's refused.
Star Trek. Kirk is still kicking.
Yeah, that would be a good thing. Just this year, somebody said, "Look, Picard's been so great. Are you going to do it?" And he went, "No. Kirk had his day." We're not going to get to see that. But I think
Kirk or Picard.
Yeah, we need to know, right? It's an old question. But I think Kirk was much more attached to his young character, as witnessed by the corset and the starvation diet.
And also interesting that Patrick Stewart also played a 90-year-old character in Logan.
Right.
And he died.
It's a problem.
And he had mental problems.
Old people die.
Okay,
But
technically he was
better.
stabbed to death by Project X-20.
I think that's also very common when I started making lists of, old person in this episode, oops, they're dead. They often did not die of old age. They often died of decapitation and other things. But it was just very noticeable how often they died.
But even more interesting is that one of the villains thinks he's 80, or in his 80s. But he's actually in his 90s.
Actually 90. Because my mother did that when she was 69. She told somebody she was 70. And I went, "Mom, why are you aging yourself up?" She said, "Well, because then people say, oh, you look so good for a woman of 70. Okay.
Did you also take a look at, because the Starfleet is quite similar in its structure to US Navy. Did you look at the comparison of age per rank?
I did, and there are some interesting things. So the Navy has an up or out policy,
Yes.
so that if you haven't reached a certain rank by a certain age, then you need to go do something else. You're not making it. So there is a bias towards specific age groups in specific ranks, but it's nowhere near as prevalent as here. And also, again, retirement age of 75, and we do see some older captains just never on the core ship generally. So I tried to do better correlations on that, and I ended up not being, it just was too fuzzy. I didn't come up with anything particularly strong.
Yeah, because I think in the US Navy, I took a quick look at the stats. So the average age for the rank of captain amongst officers was around 34.
Okay.
So that means that most of the bridge crew, who are lieutenants of different grades, right?
But they were around the same age, and that's the interesting thing
Yeah,
about
that's
the
the
Navy,
interesting
is that
thing,
they're all in their early 30s.
Usually in the military structure they are younger, because most militaries have this up or out approach, because if you are not able to grow, then it's not even an age thing, it's more of a competence and potential thing.
Yeah. The other difference between the US Navy and Star Trek is that admirals and commodores tend to be in their 40s, which makes very little sense. And so I actually, when I was listing tropes, I had a label that was commodores younger than captains.
Yeah.
And so you had these captains in their 50s, but the commodores and admirals, until Picard, tended to be younger. And on one, it was, the script described this guy as in the original Star Trek. It said, he's a few years older than Captain Kirk. Captain Kirk's 34. He's a few years older than Captain Kirk, but the admiral is still virile. And he's 36. You know? What is going on? So, yeah, so I don't buy that they were mimicking that system, but I think there's a lot of different things all coming in at the same time. Other questions?
I think one of the takeaways is that gerontology is not going to be a very nice science in the next 200 years. If we go
Well, and this is where my old women in science fiction stuff came up, is that we can't work out what is the job of old people in the future. If we don't need the experience, and we don't need the knowledge, and we don't need, all these things are downloadable or automated, then what is the point of old people? And if you had told me, oh, there's this plot where there's a pandemic that attacks old people and kills them while the younger people just have flu, I'd have been like, yeah, figures. I think I might have complained that it wasn't very realistic, but here we are.
Although technically we're going on a course where the medicine is making the quality of life higher in the higher years. So basically, in 200 years, people should be able to live to the 200s and still be healthy and happy.
So having up the age range to 137, there is this question of okay, so if you can keep working to 137, why is everybody in their 60s falling to pieces? So, you know, they somehow did not follow through on that concept. But again, stated in the episode Bible that the age of retirement is 75. So there's definitely a mindset of people are functional and capable, but they just don't show it.
Yeah, but if you live to 200 and you retire at 75, then indeed you have a question of what is the point of old people?
Yes, so you still have this huge amount of time, which is what are you doing during this time? Vulcans don't have this problem, though. They just kind of like, well, I'm still working. Of course I'm still working. I'm only 200. You know? And then we have, at the opposite side, we were talking about this last night, at the opposite side you have Kes, who, I'm 3 years old, you know, you don't have to talk to me like I'm a child. And then, you know, she's an old woman at 9, and what do you do with that? So,
She's a grandmother at 9.
a grandmother at 9, yes, thanks. But, so you do get this real confusion as to how do we want to deal with age and what happens when it's accelerated. I think Kes is better thought through, though, than most of the things. Okay, I think it's lunchtime.
Yes, thank you, Sylvia.